All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, March 28th of 2022. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. First off, I'm excited to be back. I was gone for a couple days here last week and through the weekend. So very first things here. First of all, a big thank you to Chris, who was picking up some of the slack here. I see in the channel, answering some questions in the Office Hours Slack channel over the weekend. So thank you very much, Chris. I did as best as I could to kind of keep up with things. The one thing I did see over and over is that our users in the Slack channel were crushing NASCAR and MMA and Formula One this weekend. It looked like a pretty successful weekend here for those sports in particular. And I just wanted to shout out, just in case you've missed what has been going on here at SaberSim over the past couple months with these sports, we have now full support for all three, full simulations, distributions, correlations, all of those wonderful things that help bring upside into your lineups for these sports. And I've been talking to different members of the team and recording a bunch of videos over the past couple of weeks on these three sports. So on our YouTube channel, we've got a couple playlists set up for these, but we've got the racing sports kind of grouped together here, and an MMA video I did with Will. If you are just grinding out NBA or hockey DFS every single night and haven't taken the opportunity to at least give one of these sports a try, I really think you're leaving money on the table. We've got a lot of content here on YouTube explaining why simulations are so helpful for these sports, why they're so important, and also walking you through how to get started building lineups for these sports, right? Even if you are unfamiliar to these sports on kind of more the sports fan sized, you can take advantage of the Sims, use SaberSim to build winning lineups for these sports, even without a lot of knowledge about them. So I would say pretty much brand new to, at the very least, NASCAR and Formula One here. Obviously didn't get a chance to play this weekend, but after talking to the team here and getting more and more familiar with the simulations and the sports, it's pretty clear that you can kind of step right in and crush here, just taking advantage of these sims. So a big congratulations, of course, to everybody that had success, especially it seems like in the Formula One streets this weekend. There was a lot of winning going on in Slack, so I love to see that. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into it here. Again, we're going to pick things up at roughly where I kind of saw the break point of the questions that Chris hadn't answered yet. So we'll kind of start there. We had a couple questions that have come in through support over the weekend as well. So we'll get to those. A variety of questions. I saw some MLB questions kind of starting to trickle in. A couple questions about the NBA Sims, especially as news is breaking. Some contest selection questions. Some late swap questions. So quite a bit of diversity here overall. Should be a pretty fun stream. As always, as we get going here, if you have questions for me, put them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or into YouTube chat, and we'll kind of get into questions in about chronological order. Looks like getting a warm welcome here. Clint's here in the sold out arena watching the show live. Looks like Matt's here. Welcome. Will is here as well, giving me some news that I was not aware of, but looks like some more work got done over the weekend while I was out. Will says we've got Counter-Strike distributions in the app now as well. Looks like maybe some new detailed projections as well. So another update here coming through over the weekend, which is pretty exciting. Maybe we'll have Will on here for another Counter-Strike stream in the near future. So pretty exciting stuff. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into it here. I'm going to start with the first question I've got for today. Let me get this pulled up here. All right, cool. So this came in actually, looks like through Twitter here. And this question says, need some help with the simulator. So I have a core group, but I don't know how to let the simulator know exactly how I favor them, if you catch my drift. So a question kind of in general is like, how can you get more exposure to the players that you want to have a lot of exposure to in your lineups? And I think there's actually quite a few different ways to do this in the app, and it's going to depend ultimately on what you are trying to accomplish, and also just kind of where the projections are by default. So I would recommend, before you come in here for any slate, just start with what we call a test build. And a test build is going to be, you don't touch any projections, you don't touch any ownership, you don't touch any settings, apart from telling us what contest you are building lineups for, right? So come in here, we will adjust. Obviously, right, I think what an important piece here is that the settings that are used to build your lineups are going to change based on the contest you are playing. So that's an important part of the puzzle here. But tell us what contest you're building lineups for. Maybe it's a 20 max, 10 to 50K, right? And just click Start New Build. And this is basically going to help you know how much work you need to do, right? Say you've got a pool of, you've done some research, you've got a pool of 3 to 5 players or something like that you want to be over the field on, right? We'll see here in a moment. If you're getting 100% exposure to one of these guys by default, you're good, right? We don't really need to do anything to add any additional value. Maybe you've done some research, right? It's going to be kind of a weird slate tonight as we approach the end of basketball season with some serious value plays starting to show up. It looks like this OKC and Portland game is going to be a little bit of a mess. But if you've come in here and said, maybe Theo Maledon is one of your core plays, right? Obviously a pretty elite value on tonight. We're getting 75% exposure to him in 20 lineups for this contest. Not a lot of work we need to do, right? If you get to step 3 in general, we like to think about step 3 kind of as quality control. So if you're looking at your core here, and maybe another name that you had identified as a potential option on tonight's slate, let's see if I can find someone. Maybe someone like Bam, right? Just as kind of a hypothetical, right? In your research, his name popped up. You knew you wanted some exposure. Kings play at a pretty fast pace, right? Maybe you want to get a little exposure to Bam. And you come in here and you're seeing that you're getting 10% exposure. Even with the field, you kind of had decided you wanted to be over the field. One of the very easiest things to do on SaberSim, one of the big advantages of using SaberSim here is that you can just edit and fine tune your exposures in step 3 here without having to go back to step 1 necessarily and make a bunch of changes to get things where you want. So if part of your core here, right, let's kind of build out a core together. Let's say we had Maledon was one, right, and that one's just good. We don't really need to touch that. And then another core play was Bam for us here. And we knew that we wanted a little bit more exposure. We could just come in here and say, give me 30% exposure to Bam, and we'll go through and sort through the pool of 500 and give you the best 20 here that have at least 30% Bam at a bio, right? So maybe we don't want to lose out on our Maledon lineups here either. So we'll bump that back up to 75%, right? So step 3 can be very useful for making kind of, we call them fine-tuning, quality control type adjustments to your exposures overall. But let's say, for example, that we had a player that we weren't getting any exposure to in this test build, right? Maybe somebody like Darius Garland, right? Not projected all that well, but maybe he's popping in your research, maybe a lower owned play, somebody that you want to get a little bit of exposure to, and you're not getting any exposure to Garland, right? And we can come in here and maybe, we can try to see if we can get like 30% Garland exposure. And it's definitely possible or maybe even likely. So in this case, we were able to get 30% Garland exposure, right? But eventually, let's say we also wanted Julius Randle. Let's say we wanted, and we wanted 50% exposure to all these guys, right? Let's see if that works. Oh, it works. Okay. Well, I'll make the point I'm trying to make anyway here. It's very easy in step 3 if you're tweaking around a lot of exposures and starting to add exposure to players that by default the builder was not giving you exposure to, aren't very good projected plays. It can be better to go back to step 1 and boost those players' projections. So why I said that it's good to start with a test build is it's useful to see what you need to do. So in this case, if our core was Maledon, Bam, Randall, and Garland, it just has 4 kind of hypothetical names I pulled out. Maybe it was enough to just boost everybody's exposure in step 3, right? We were good. We kind of got where we needed to go. But if you run into an error where that's not working, or you're doing that and you're finding that you're not liking the lineups overall, a very good thing to do, I think, is to come back to step 1 and bump player projections up by about 10%. And that's going to basically still take advantage of the simulations. You're not making a significant change to those players' projection, but it's going to give the signal to the builder that you kind of like those players. And I get this question overall quite a bit from people, where people say, how do I tell SaberSim that I like or don't like a player, right? I think a very, very good way to do that while still taking advantage of the simulations is using 10% boosts or bumps on certain player projections. So if we wanted to come back and do that again, right, we could bump Garland by, let's say 44.88, or sorry, 47.88, 4-point bump. And let's bump Randall 4 points as well. And then we can run another build, right? See where things kind of sit. And then fine tune our exposures again and make sure everything kind of settles in the where we want them to be. So we'll give this a moment to build. But I wouldn't overall, in general, I wouldn't recommend adjusting projections until you've done the test build. One, just in the interest of time, right? Time is very valuable for NBA. A lot of times, if you've done your research and kind of found your core plays, a lot of times our model is probably going to agree with most of them. You're probably getting exposure to the best plays on the slate by default. And you may not need to do that, or you may be able to get a lot of value in step 3. But 2, it's an opportunity to kind of check yourself here too, right? So let's go ahead and look through this and see what we're getting. But now we're getting 60% Randall, right? It is interesting, I think, that after bumping Darius Garland 10% on his projection, we're still only getting one lineup with Garland here, even with the 10% projection boost, right? And in some ways, you can kind of think of that as, even if Garland's mean projection was 110% of how we projected him, he's still not a very good play. Maybe at this point, since we've taken the opportunity to run the test build and then boost him by 10 and run another build, maybe we strike him out from our core and we say, we don't really want to force exposure to this player that even with a 110% projection boost is still not a very good play, right? So maybe we let that one go, but we're getting a lot of Randall exposure. And then our other names were Bam, who's now not showing up at all, probably because some Randall exposure ended up taking those spots, but we can go ahead and give him another 30% here. And Maladon. And just for the sake of it, let's say we do decide that we still want to play some Garland. So we come back here and give 30%. Right. So SaberSim ultimately is going to be best used when you're taking advantage of the kind of many tools at your disposal, right? Run your test build. Don't touch anything. See how things look. See what you can kind of get away with, essentially. See what kind of adjustments the builder is flexible to on step 3. Can you just set minimum exposures to the players that you want to be heavily exposed to? Or are you seeing an error message or the lineup's not coming out the way you want? If that's the case, then go back to step 1, make some adjustments, boost up the players you want to see more of in your lineups by about 10% of their mean projection, run another build, see where things stand, and continue to iterate there until you get into the lineups you want. The one other thing I will mention, just because I know when people start talking about their core groups, there's often an expectation of seeing, many of those players or all of those players in every single lineup. If you wanted, let's say, so we have a group of 4 players here. If you wanted not only to have minimum exposure set for all of these players, but also to make sure, for example, that at least 3 were in all of your lineups, you can accomplish that with a group. So you can come over here in the build settings, go to the rules tab, and then go to the groups. And then what we'll do is we'll create a group and we'll add these 4 guys. So it was Garland and Randall. And again, for tonight's slate, I'm just making this core up, right? Obviously, late season NBA here. It's 2:00 Eastern. Not really a good time to start your research process. But let's go ahead and say that this hypothetically is our kind of core group of 4 guys. And by default, the rule will be at least 3, right? Maybe you want exactly 3. It's another option. But if you went ahead and did this, now you would make sure you could maintain those exposures. You have those projection boosts in there, but you've also set a rule to get, I don't know why you would want equal to exactly 3. I think maybe less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to, at least, right? Is probably what most people would want to do here. So again, it kind of depends ultimately on what you are trying to accomplish. But there are some combination of boosting player projections by 10% in step 1, setting minimum exposures in step 3, and potentially creating a group to force those players into your lineups will get the job done. So, all right, cool. I see YouTube chat is blowing up here. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in here today. We will get to everything. I'm going to continue to jump through the questions that were in Slack ahead of time on the stream, and then we'll move over to YouTube chat here. Catalyst Joe asks a good question here. And it's kind of an interesting question here. But he says, so after lock, when doing a late swap, does the swap happen in order from the top contest down? I would assume in order to make the min unique stay true, it would be best for me to have the highest contest swap first so they build with the least restrictions. Yes. So that is true. And it doesn't have, I would say, an enormous impact, right? But it does have some impact. So when you go into late swap, the first actual lineup that does get swapped will be the first entries, or the first contest, I guess, that get swapped. The entries in your contest at the top will get swapped first. So in this case, the pick and roll, if I was late swapping here, would get swapped first. And for things like following minimum and maximum exposure requirements and min uniques, that can have a very minor impact, right? Exactly the way you've described. The least restricted lineup, in effect, will be the first one swapped. Secondly, and this really is only going to be a factor, I would say, on small slates or slates where you are building on very low sim variance. If we swap a lineup, right? So we'll build lineup 1. Lineup 2 could theoretically be swapped into a duplicate of lineup 1. If that happens, we throw it out. We will never dupe your lineups in between. We will never dupe your lineups when you're building a late swap. But if that could theoretically happen. And what that's basically saying is the most efficient swap for both contests is the same lineup. So we're going to only put that into the first contest. And then for the second lineup, we're going to use the second best lineup. That's a very, 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 very small impact ultimately in the grand scheme of things as it shakes out. But that can be another thing that kind of comes into play here in your late swaps. So I don't think it's a huge factor. I wouldn't sweat about this at all. But yes, being completely specific here, it is your first contest in the list that gets swapped first. So good question there. Okay, and then there was a question here, a couple questions from Tone 930 here about Showdown ownership. So he had asked, are there any plans in the work to maybe try to use the algorithm to narrow down ownerships for showdowns to estimate specific ownerships for different position types like MVP, utility, as opposed to the generic one, size all ownerships that we have now? So we do actually do this for DraftKings at the moment. We will give you captain ownership and utility ownership and separate them out. So if we go into here, let's see, this terrible game of two tanking teams here tonight, that is our night slate game, right? So these ownerships on the captain column are for that player's use in the captain spot, right? And these ownerships are for that player's use in the utility spot. And I actually think it's one of the strengths of SaberSim overall, because we are using a algorithmic method to generate ownerships by building real lineups at high variance settings. We can actually we can project ownership for virtually every slate that we have simulations for. But two, we can adjust very quickly and pretty accurately because it doesn't really require any human involvement to get this done. So they are there for DraftKings. On FanDuel, you do get the just kind of static overall ownership of how often a player shows up in any lineup. It's not sorted by MVP or star or pro or utility. And the reason for that, as Shady Advice described in the Slack channel, is because at the moment, FanDuel uses the exact same player IDs regardless of whether a player is in the MVP slot or the utility spot. So it is not an insurmountable problem for us. I think long-term, it is our goal to have projected ownership for FanDuel for the different multiplier positions. But because of the way that they organize their data, it is a little bit more of a painful problem on our end. Because FanDuel also does not scale salaries for the multiplier positions, it simplifies the game a bit. And I actually think that the ultimate impact of this is that the highest projected players at any one position are the highest projected players at all of the positions. So I also, given that the ownership fade slider itself is never going to be that high for single game contests on FanDuel, I don't think it has a huge impact. But it is something that long term, I think we do want to adjust. It's just going to kind of require some clever data manipulation on our end. So, but it is there for DraftKings here. And then more on kind of the strategy side, there was a follow-up here from Tone, and he said, also, could you explain how you personally use the ownership projections as we currently have it for Showdown as it relates to the different type of roster spots? I've never really been able to feel confident in Showdowns because I have difficulty trying to guesstimate what guys will be used by the field, so I typically avoid them. Right now, I play more than FanDuel than DraftKings, but that may change for MLB season. I'm hoping to diversify my portfolio and incorporate them here and there into my DFS strategy. Thanks for your answer, Jordan. Looking forward to checking out the stream. Cool. So for Showdown, I don't use ownership projections as much in the same way as main slates, as I think there is often ownership inefficiency on main slates, especially for NBA surrounding late swap. There may be a player that should be owned 10% of, or should be owned 40% of the time. He's owned by 10% of the field, maybe because news broke late. And there is an ownership inefficiency overall where I want to just have more exposure than the field to that player. That player's probability of success is far higher than that player's ownership, and I want to be on the right side of that, right? It provides leverage in your lineup portfolio in a very typical way, right? A very familiar way. In Showdowns, I don't think as often, especially in NBA, that you are going to get significant ownership inefficiencies where there is a singular player that should be owned in, again, maybe 40% of the lineups that's only owned in 10% of the lineups, partly because the player pool is a little bit smaller, right? It's harder for there to be that level of ownership inefficiency. I think the bigger edge in Showdown, especially when using simulations, is properly attacking a game script, right? That's essentially what the game of Showdowns is an understanding of how the different ways that a game can play out, what players have success in different game scripts, how the context of a game affects different players together, right? And then building a lineup that has a high percent chance or is optimal for a particular set of game scripts. And that is essentially automatically what happens here for your Showdown contests, right? When you come in here, NBA Showdown, sim variance is at 10. Every single lineup is going to have an individual simulation associated with it. Every lineup you're looking at is essentially optimal for a game script, for a simulation of the way that the game could play out. And our ownership fade slider is relatively low. And in fact, I think it comes down here as you come down a little bit to even smaller contests, right? What the ownership fade slider is really doing from a functional level here is it is trying to look for lineups that are unlikely to be duplicated, right? It is taking a overall set of lineups and then giving you the optimals for individual sets of game simulations that have a total overall combined ownership product to help diversify your lineups and give you a lineup that's more likely to be unique. But we are not really leveraging against ownership inefficiency for Showdown specifically in the same way as I would say we are for a main slate. And that's a strategic thing, right? I'm not saying that the builder actually literally functions differently for these different slates. I'm just saying that strategically in a main slate, right, you don't need the stone optimal to win most slates. And you can find players where ownership is inefficient based on the probability of showing up in the winning lineup, get more exposure to them. In Showdowns, we need the optimal, right? What we're trying to do is find unique optimals, right? So overall, I guess to kind of circle back to the actual core question here, I would say a little less concerned with the raw ownership projections in Showdown in terms of who's going to be chalky than I am in a main slate. I would say mostly what I'm interested in doing is I'm generally pretty interested in seeing who the chalkiest captains are for a slate. This game is such a mess. It's such a weird one here. But I'm interested in seeing who the chalkiest captains are, right? Because I may just take some very aggressive stands on chalky captains to get a more unique lineup. But if I were to completely fade Captain Trey Mann in this game here, it wouldn't be because I thought that his raw probability of being the highest scoring captain was significantly lower than 18.6%. It would be because there are probably so many different captain options that have upside, that can be in the winning lineup, that I would rather play the optimal lineups for constructions where the winning captain is, or lineup constructions that are much more likely to be unique. So let me know if that makes sense. I know, Tone, I know you typically end up watching these streams here on the recordings on YouTube. So we get a chance to watch this. Let me know if you have any kind of follow-up questions there. Happy to dive in a little bit further here from there. So a couple other questions in Slack. Let's keep it going. This is also from Tone. And he said, when playing the later slates and the smaller contests with them, do you recommend maxing out for the contests where doing so doesn't take up more than 1% of the total entries in a given contest? Okay. For example, tonight I'm playing multiple NBA slates for the first time in a long time. I entered the Piggy on FanDuel for the late slate. I only entered 12 lineups out of the 150 max entries because the contest only has 11.9K entries. Is this a solid strategy, or should I play more? Okay, so first of all, the 1% rule, right? Not taking up more than 1% of the lineups in the contest. In this case, that would be 120 lineups, right? Not 12. So there might have been a transposition of a digit there. For something like the Piggy contest, right? That's going to be a pretty flat payout structure in general. It's a nickel contest. I would probably just max it out because the difference of an additional 30 entries in a Piggy contest isn't going to break the bank. I would say if you were sticking strictly to some of the 1% guidelines that I recommend, it would be strictly correct to play 120 entries. You, I guess, preserve a little bit higher upside or ROI in that contest by doing so. In this particular contest, I think I would probably just max it out personally. But yes, I think in the interest of maximizing ROI and kind of following some of the rules that I've described here on stream before, I think it would be strictly correct to play 120 in that contest. But at the very low stakes, a lot of times I will just end up maxing the contests out, getting the maximum number of lineups I can in play for that contest. And I'm a little more cautious with exceeding 1% of the total entries in the contest in higher stakes or medium stakes contests, where I feel each additional entry a little bit more, where each additional entry beyond 1% of the total lineups in the contests really starts to feel like more of a sacrifice, I guess. So good question. Okay. And then a couple other questions here. This one says, does SaberSim use any outside source for projected starting lineups, or are they generated in-house? I only ask because I've noticed different expected lineups across different resources at times. Yeah, there can be some discrepancies around the industry. I believe we have a handful of different sources that we use together to kind of project what we think are going to be the starting lineups before that information is confirmed. I don't know or remember exactly which of those sources are included there, but it's not a singular source of truth for us. We have a few different sources that we kind of check on here. But yeah, especially at this point of the season, I think there can be discrepancies before those lineups are confirmed of what different outlets believe is likely to be the starting lineup. And followed up with a feature request here, which I actually think is a really good idea. I will pass this along. But Tone said here, in a future update, could you add an expected to start indicator to the status column so it's easy to reference if any surprises pop up? I think it's a really good idea, actually. I had never thought about doing that. But maybe something like, I don't know, a yellow, I'm visualizing some kind of yellow mark here as like expected to start for this game. I think that's a pretty clever idea. So I will pass that along. I can definitely see how that would be useful as news breaks to go in and check, right? Maybe you get something that kind of feels like a surprise lineup for the Rockets, and you can go in here and see if it actually is a surprise starting lineup or not. So would also be helpful when you're in a pinch waiting for maybe some final sims to finish to decide if you really need to wait to capture the updated information from the results of news breaking. So I like that idea a lot. On that note, we have a good question from GA33 here on the sims that run as news breaks for late swap. And he said last night, Gobert was ruled out 10 minutes before the next game locked at 4. 5 sims were running for Utah Dallas. Only a couple of sims were complete with enough time to late swap for the 4 o'clock game. My options were to go ahead and late swap with only some of the sims complete, or wait until all the sims completed and get swaps from only the last 2 games. For SaberSim, is one option better than the other, or is there not much of a difference either way? Hope that made sense. See the situation from time to time. Yeah, so that can definitely happen. If there's significant news breaking, it will often trigger a few different sims to run. And ultimately what's happening there is we're getting the impacts of that news hitting a couple of our other data providers at different times. So Gobert gets ruled out and a sim is triggered because one of our providers for some piece of data has updated and we resim for that, right? And then another updates and we resim for that. And especially in these situations where there's big news, you will often see that. First of all, on the practical side of things, well, actually, let me kind of explain what actually happens here. Generally, if you see multiple sims running for a game after news breaks, the first one will probably contain 80 to 90%, maybe even 90 to 95% of the value of that change, right? So you are absolutely capturing the value of knowing that Gobert is going to be out and the impacts of that on the Jazz when the first sim completes. The ensuing sims that come from there are generally going to be kind of fine-tuning and dialing things in to get them to that final point of basically saying we have 100% confirmed lineup and complete here. So I always say when these questions or questions of this form come in, there is nothing more negative EV than missing the lock of a game. So we've put a lot of work into getting our NBA sims as fast as possible, but especially as we approach the end of the season and we're going to have very late scratches, very late news breaking. If there is a sim complete and there's news that has broken and you are minutes away from that game locking, absolutely, please late swap and take advantage of it. Worst case scenario, if you do that a little bit early and you realize you still have a little bit more time to capture one of the later sims that run, you can always late swap again. But the last thing you want to do is miss a lock because you were waiting for the 4th sim that fired that started running for this news break when the first 3 were already complete. Or in this case, it looks like 5 sims ran, 5 sims triggered here. 2 of them were already complete. Absolutely, please late swap in that situation. Again, the first sim that runs, and especially like maybe even the first 2, contain probably 90 to 95% of the value there from that news breaking. And remember too, an important thing to remember is that everybody you are playing with is dealing with the same time crunch. Right? So you've got to remember kind of thinking about of your opponents that are in the contest. Everybody's dealing with this, right? There's people trying to update projections, trying to update minutes models, trying to change. Maybe they have min and max exposure set for every single team on the slate. Maybe they had a bunch of Utah Jazz player groups that they're trying to undo to get everything to work. Maybe they want to late swap, but they don't want to end up with 100% exposure to Hassan Whiteside. I didn't play this weekend. I don't even know if Whiteside was active or what the situation exactly was there, right? But everybody's dealing with that time crunch. So pick your spots, right? There's a ton of value added by getting that swap in, even if you know that maybe there was one sim that was going to finish 20 seconds before the slate locked that you have to sacrifice. So definitely take advantage of that and don't sweat. I fall victim to this too sometimes as well. Where you're waiting for that last sim to finish. And again, we made these as fast as possible, but they do take a couple minutes at times. I would say as a general rule of thumb, if you are late swapping and waiting for a sim to finish, I would not wait beyond 5 minutes till the game starts, right? Beyond that, like get the swap in. Worst case scenario, again, and if you're newer to SaberSim, right, that may be even too much, right? You may be better off swapping 10 minutes before just to make sure it gets done and you know what's going on and you got that information into your lineups as best as you could. But I would highly recommend not pushing yourself beyond 5 minutes till the start of the game whose information changed, because you can definitely start to push it a little bit close there, especially if you're doing multiple sites or slates or anything like that. So But I'm reading this question back, and I think that answer was still helpful, but I'm realizing that the context of this question was a little bit different. So in this specific situation, and again, this is partly because I didn't have the chance to play DFS this weekend here. So it looks like in the actual written context of the question, it was the Lakers and Pelicans starting at 4, and the Utah game where the Gobert news ultimately affected was at 4:30, and Sims were running before the 4:00 game. So this does actually simplify things a little bit. In this situation, I still would have swapped before the 4:00 game so that you have 3 games to work with, right? I'm sure a bunch of value opened up for Utah, and you wouldn't want a situation where you locked in a bunch of random Lakers and Pelicans and lost the ability to be more flexible to your ultimate late swap at 4:30. So what I would have specifically done in this exact situation is I would have late swapped with only 2 Sims complete at 4 or just before 4, and then probably late swapped again with the final fully complete Sims just a little bit before 4:30. So I apologize for that. I think my answer was still probably helpful for a more generic case, or maybe a case where you only have 2 minutes before the actual game starts. That's in question here. But in this exact written example here, I would have just swapped both times. So anyway, let's move on here. Great question there. And this is a question here from Stanley. And it's a kind of a tough one. He said, can you rank what sports have the highest ROI using Sims? I would assume it's the sports where correlations are high. It's a tough question to answer. I would say almost all sports, DFS sports, can benefit significantly from using simulations, because what you are doing when you are simulating the sport out is you are generating the full range of outcomes of different players in that sport. Right? I mean, the failure of average projections across all sports is they are not predictive of upside. Average projections don't understand what actually high scoring upside looks like on an individual player basis. They require the person using those projections to kind of come up with some way to extrapolate what an average projection means for upside, but they also don't understand correlation, right? They don't understand they don't deal with ownership very well in terms of where efficient ownership may be for a particular player. So simulations are always useful. At the end of the day, we are still playing a game. We are playing a game that involves predicting the results of other sporting events, right? Where context is important. So understanding a game script of how a game might play out, and how a game is played out one play at a time, and the play that takes place, the second play, is based on the context of what happened in the first play. And there's this compounding effect of, you can do this for any sport, right? The final lap of a NASCAR race, you can't just say what that is without understanding how the race went before that. You can't predict what kind of play is going to get run in a football game without knowing the score and the time remaining on the clock. You can't understand how a particular basketball game may be playing without knowing how many fouls the star players have, or how close that game is. 2 MMA fighters are going to be fighting differently, whether it's the very beginning of the fight or they're exhausted at the end of round 3, right? All of that kind of stuff. Simulations are really valuable for all of them. With that said, there are individual sport-specific reasons, I think, of why in one sport you may get more out of the Sims from a particular reason than others. Right? We were kind of just doing that here, but baseball, right? Baseball's coming up. That's obviously, or even not so obviously, if you're new to baseball, right? It's a high correlation sport. Every time a hitter gets on base, they prevent an out. The next person in the order comes up, and each on base event that happens scores points for batters, but also is the absence of an out. It gives everybody more opportunities to continue to hit. It's one of the main reasons baseball is a very high correlation sport. So simulating out baseball and understanding the correlations of individual batters to one another gives you an edge, because it allows you to build lineups that are well correlated without having to set rules or do anything like that, right? In, I think, football showdowns, for example, is like a very classic example of where game script is massively important, right? You can't just build a lineup with players that are generally projected on average. If you're getting a running back in your captain spot that also has the maybe another running back from the same team and the running back from the other team, right? That needs to make sense. There needs to be an associated game script for that lineup. That lineup might be viable, it might not, but without being able to simulate out the range of outcomes of the game and understand what these scripts look like, you wouldn't really be able to answer that question for yourself if that's actually a viable lineup. So I don't know if I can very easily rank what sports have the highest ROI. I would say that broadly speaking, if I was to make a big generalization, high correlation, high variance sports where players have further away from a normal distribution are going to be sports where I think you can get a bigger or at least a more obvious advantage to using simulations, because those are things that average projections and traditional optimizers on their own are not going to deal with very well. So, but there are other factors that come into play here, right? I've crushed NBA this season, basically playing pretty close to what SaberSim gives me on most nights. SaberSim or NBA is a lower correlation sport where players are a little more normally distributed, and I think there's still a massive edge in one using sims, but I guess especially in using SaberSim because of how quickly we are able to update our game simulations when news breaks, and taking advantage of just massive ownership inefficiencies when late swapping. So that's kind of, I wouldn't say that's maybe an explicit advantage to simulations, or it's not the first thing you think of, at least for me, when I think of what the advantage of sims are, but it is still a very big advantage of using SaberSim. So I guess to wrap this up, if I kind of had to make a decision, I think the softest sport, the highest theoretical ROI sport that you're going to find out there is football. It's a very casual friendly sport. The contests are massive. There's a lot of DFS players out there in the NFL waters that frankly really don't know what they're doing at all. And it's just very, very soft contests. They are huge contests. It can take a lot of time to realize your expected value in NFL, but it is definitely the softest sport. From there, I think probably I would say baseball and NBA are both close, maybe a slight edge to baseball. Contests are a little smaller, but a higher correlation sport, higher variance sport where you get some pretty significant ownership inefficiency on chalky stacks and pitchers and hitters. NBA has bigger contests. I think sometimes a little bit of softer competition. The biggest edge in NBA, from my perspective, is taking advantage of late swap and late swapping properly. I imagine as NASCAR and MMA and even Formula One get more and more popular, I think we'll see, and especially as we have a little bit of a bigger data set on our end, I think we're going to find that those are sports where sims really just give you an enormous edge. They may be actually some of the sports where I may a year from now be saying that the highest theoretical ROI sports to use simulations for are those three sports. But our simulations for them are somewhat new, and I think they're somewhat newer sports, at least at this level of popularity. So I'm a little unsure where to put them right now. But yeah, so interesting question there. Cool. Let's keep it going. All right. A couple other questions here in Slack. I promise we will get to everything here today. We've got a lot of questions in our queue, which is great. This was from Average Call of Duty player here. He said, besides 500 lineups and the ability to import and export stats, what am I missing between the 49 and 89 plan? Also, any chance of a yearly option at a discount? I do believe we have a yearly option that does save you a little bit off the total of just basically paying for 12 months. So if you want to do that, email the support team, support@sabersim.com, and they'll be able to help you out with that. I don't believe there's any other difference. The only difference between the starter and advanced plan is the ability to, it's not just 500 lineups in your pool. It is the ability to view your pool, view all of your lineups, basically view more than 20 lineups or export more than 20 lineups from a build at a time. That's probably the biggest functional difference. So if you're on the starter plan, right, you will be limited to 20 lineups at a time, basically. And I think your pool size is maybe limited to 500. That might be correct, but that's probably the biggest difference. And then obviously you can't export as a CSV the player projections or import your own player projections in bulk. You can still make adjustments to players here one by one, but no bulk editing of projections. So, but I think that ultimately, if you're trying to decide what plan is right for you, I would think about how many lineups you're planning on playing. If you're planning on playing 20 or less unique lineups per slate, you're probably going to be perfectly fine on a starter plan. If you are planning on playing more than 20 unique lineups per slate, you should upgrade to the advanced. So, okay. And then Andrew asks an interesting question here, a baseball question. So let me actually real quick, before I answer this, I want to hit this one real quick because I saw it and I had wanted to mention this anyway. This was from Adam. He said, more of a SaberSim logistical question. Curious when you guys are planning on doing baseball-specific content in office hours as the season approaches, and if there's any changes to the sim that are currently shareable. Thanks. Yeah, so we do have some exciting news on the baseball front. Obviously, the models team is working hard behind the scenes to make adjustments, make updates for this particular season here, getting everything ready. The back-end team's getting all of our data ready. I think we'll have some front-end changes that are coming out along the start of baseball season as well. So should be a very exciting time. On the content side, we will be having a number of baseball-specific streams and videos coming out, I would say, over the next 10-ish days as we approach opening day. So we'll be having a stream similar to what I did with Kingfish, kind of an interviewing and expert style stream here. And then also very likely a stream with the models team talking about what goes into our baseball sims, some improvements we made for this season, the value of using simulations for baseball, and then probably accumulating all of that together in kind of a short how to beat baseball DFS with SaberSim. That'll probably closer to be like that 10 or 15 minute mark as kind of a tutorial of how to beat baseball DFS. So a lot of baseball content coming out over the next 10 days. On the office hour side, I'm happy to start answering baseball questions basically as soon as you guys have them. Obviously, there's a kind of a limit to what we can really do sharing the screen before we have at least the opening day slate up without just going back to last season. But on that note, I guess we'll jump in here and answer this question from Andrew. Thoughts on MLB slate size and optimal stack sizing? Should we be considering at least 3 on the 3 to 6 game slates rather than going at least 4 to 5 on the 7 game plus slates? And this is an interesting question, right? As the slate size gets smaller and there are less players overall in the pool, right? There are less options for people to click on. The winning lineup in your contests is likely to get closer to the optimal scoring lineup for that particular contest. And on one hand, right, that theoretically is saying that the influence of correlation should come down a little bit, right? And it actually does. I'm not going to pull this up here because I think while we're getting everything set up for baseball, I've noticed when I pull this up on stream that the old slates for baseball is a little slow. So I'm not going to pull it up now, but you will notice, especially as we approach baseball season, that the correlation slider is coming down as you get smaller slate sizes. You'll actually see the sim variance slider comes up. And that is basically accounting for that particular impact, right? It is saying as there are less games on the slate, there are less players available for people to build lineups with. The winning lineups are going to approach the actual highest scoring optimal a little more closely. So let's take the average correlation of players, the impact of that on our lineups, and bring that down a little bit and widen the range of outcomes, use a smaller set of simulations overall for each individual lineup and increase the variance, right? Let's try to approach the actual scoring lineup a little bit closer. So that would, in theory, I think, overall make you think that you want smaller stack sizes or be comfortable with smaller stacks for actual slates. In practice, I haven't actually really noticed that too much because the fact that the player pool is getting smaller as well, right, often ends up meaning that the optimal lineup or the best lineups you can make end up being stacked a little bit more anyway, right? Because there's just less players to choose from. If you have a 4-game slate where one team scores 12 runs and the next best team scored 6, right? At that point, there are so much less options on the slate period that you don't even need the average correlation impact in your lineup construction to be very high to just get a natural 4 stack of the team that scored 12 runs, right? On a 12-game slate, there can be a team that scored 12 runs. There can be no other team that scored more than 8. And if you built the optimal lineup, you wouldn't even get a stack because there's so many other random players that had high individual upside scoring events. So ultimately, I guess the very practical answer to this is I don't typically set, or at least going into this season, I'm probably not going to be setting minimum stack rule sizing for my lineups and allowing my stacks to come to me a little more naturally just with what SaberSim wants to do. And I'll kind of let that work out naturally. I'll let the sim variance slider and the correlation slider kind of play together for the context of that slate and the contest that I'm playing, and be pretty comfortable rolling with the stacks that I get by default. And I think that's going to be overall a good approach. But I think I will be comfortable, or at least have some expectation of seeing probably a little bit smaller stack sizes on smaller slates than bigger slates. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as this gets closer. I think it's kind of an interesting intersection of the theory of what you would expect to happen and the actual in practice. A really good example of that is if you build lineups for like a 2-game slate. I think the default sliders for a 2-game slate are something like the correlation is somewhere between 0 and 2, and the sim variance is typically 10. You'll actually find that often you end up with a lot of like 5-3 stacks or 5-2 stacks or 4-4s or things like that, because because the 2 highest scoring teams, it is very likely that you can make an effective stack even with no impact of correlation added to the lineup, right? It's just very likely that the optimal lineup is often going to be a natural stack anyway. So, but we'll play around with this a little bit more as we approach, as we have some live data to start working with. I am really hoping we get slates posted on the sites here, maybe over the next week or so, just to start playing around, maybe some salaries, seeing how things are looking. So, but good question. Okay, and I see there are a couple other questions that have come in Slack. For now, I'm going to jump over to YouTube chat and get caught up on the YouTube side of things here, because I know that the YouTube chat squad has been waiting for a little while. So Eric said, how do I not play the shitty OKC value tonight? Just wondering. I'll probably play them anyway. I don't know if there's going to be a way to get away from Oklahoma City tonight in a way that is plus EV. I do think, and I would probably want to do a little bit more research on this to be comfortable. I am curious if we have any. All right. Sorry about that. I apologize. Had a quick little internet blip there. Eamon said, down goes Frazier. Yeah, very briefly, internet blip there. What I was saying, back on the OKC thing here for tonight, I probably want to do a little bit more research on this, because I don't know if we have any games from this season where the available players for OKC has been this group of players. But I think there's a good argument to be made that even after we get a starting lineup, which also could come out very late, right? So that's probably another good reason for this. But I think it makes some sense to maybe trying to think about the right way to say this here. Limit your exposure to any one particular player from the team, right? I would not expect a particularly consistent rotation here. Even potentially after we get a starting lineup. And again, if it turns out that there is a decent set of a couple games where this group of players has played together and maybe we have a sense of what the rotation looks like and maybe it's consistent, I could be wrong here. But when you're just basically talking about a team that is tanking at the end of the season and playing a bunch of scrubs, I think even after we get a starting lineup, the minutes might be kind of inconsistent here or a little bit unpredictable. If somebody looks good out there that came off the bench, I could see them getting some extended run, right? So at this point, I think OKC is right. They're tanking, trying to get a good draft pick, and mostly trying to see like what are these, how good are these guys, right? Who can play here? So I think there's an argument, I guess, on the practical side, there's an argument to be made about leaving your options as open as possible here, capturing the great value that this team is clearly going to present to the slate, but avoiding a situation where you're well overexposed to any one player and spreading out a little bit, I think is interesting because the ownership is probably going to follow the starting lineup ultimately, unless there's a big surprise in the starting lineup and people are really locked in to their lineup constructions because this is the island game at the end of the night. I would say that it is probably true that compared to how much value all the players on this team are going to provide tonight, it's probably true that the starters may be slightly over-owned relative to some of the other bench players, but we'll see how it all shakes out. So Michael says, what do you look for when narrowing down the player pool? I don't adjust my player pool at all. None. And I think that comes to surprise as some people. The reason why is because we are leveraging simulations when we build lineups on SaberSim, right? You are not going to get any just straight up bad plays showing up in your lineups, right? When you come in here and click the build button and tell us what contest you are building your lineups for, right? We are basically going to set the sim variance slider at a level that we think is appropriate for that contest. The sim variance slider decides how many simulations are used when building any one individual lineup. At 10, every lineup is an optimal lineup for a single game simulation. At 0, every lineup is an optimal based on the average projections, comparing all of the simulations. And we will basically use this as a sliding scale to basically say for a 20 max, 10 to 50K players for your contest, right? It makes sense to look at approximately this number of individual game sims for each lineup. So the impact of that is that any lineup you get, and by extension, any player that shows up in any lineup or that you have exposure to, is optimal for a set of simulations that is appropriately sized for the contest you told us you are playing. So you don't really need to do any curation of your player pool on SaberSim to get a good player pool for the contest you are playing. In fact, I think that most player pool curation in NBA at the very least is probably going to be pretty unnecessary unless you have some other reason for wanting to do it, right? Some of those reasons might be some curation of a player pool we've talked about eliminating selective players from the early games to preserve as much late swap flexibility in the late games as possible. Or if you were taking a very heavy ownership stand and fading maybe some certain chalky players completely in step 1, I think there can be an argument to be made for that. But you really should never feel like you have to curate a player pool on step 1 in SaberSim to get good lineups, because since we are leveraging simulations to build your lineups, any player you're getting in step 3 or in those final lineups is optimal for a set of simulations. By comparison, right, a traditional optimizer using average projections, all that is going to do is it is going to take the average projection and build the best, highest overall projected lineups possible, right? But a player that fits in just because they have a good point per dollar value does not always make that player a good play, or that does not always make that lineup a good lineup, right? Ultimately, a lot of times when you hear about people curating a player pool for a particular sport, what they are really saying they are trying to do is they are using the player pool curation as a means to the end of getting better lineups, right? And that's really what's kind of unnecessary, or at least I think it's unnecessary. It doesn't show up in my process much with SaberSim. So Steven says, what is your process in making GPP lineups on NBA? To be completely honest, to be completely upfront, most of the time, my NBA process looks something like coming in here, telling the builder what contest I am building lineups for, clicking start new build, building the lineups. We'll see these get built. And then I would say at most doing a quick check over my overall exposures to different players and making sure that nothing is out of line with what I'm comfortable with for my personal risk for that slate, right? There are many slates where I don't make any adjustments going into lock, and I basically wait for a late swap opportunity and a significant ownership inefficiency because of all the people that don't want to bother late swapping, and that is where I get my edge, right? Combined with generally sound bankroll management principles and playing the best overall contests, that is the majority of my MBA process. I would say, significantly relying on or counting on late swap opportunities, especially at this point in the season, especially on big slates. And when I don't get those, it's definitely likely that it was a slate where I maybe had a little bit of a less of an edge. But I just, from what I see with the ownership that you get after news breaks, after lock, it is clear that the vast majority of the field isn't even bothering to late swap. And I think that is the biggest way to get an edge. If you are interested in watching the process from somebody that does have a more involved process in terms of research, I would check out on our YouTube channel, Win More at NBA DFS with our 2021 course. One of the last videos here, how to beat daily fantasy basketball like an NBA DFS pro. This was recorded right at the start of the season. And this is Max Steinberg's, essentially his full NBA DFS process for a random slate earlier in the season on both DraftKings and FanDuel. And one of the big ways Max gets an edge, especially playing at the very high stakes, is researching the teams and rotations and minutes projections a little bit more closely, especially for teams where there is injuries and breaking news and things like that. And Max adds a lot of value by making adjustments to projections and things like that. Very sharp video. I think a very interesting watch. Again, it's frankly not something that I do as much. And honestly, at this point in the season, I think it can be a little bit more difficult to do that because there's the volume of news breaking at this point in the season is much higher. And the impact of news breaking at this point in the season is much higher. So I have recorded other videos that are also on our YouTube channel where I walk through, for example, my baseball process and my football process, which has a lot more, I would say, traditional kind of research. A lot of what I do for those two particular sports is looking for ownership inefficiencies with a research build. One of the main reasons I don't do that, or one of the many reasons I don't do that in basketball as much, is because of how often that news breaks. You can spend a lot of time researching. Like not only when news breaks in NBA do you get an edge by late swapping, and so many people don't, but it also kind of invalidates a lot of the research you may have done beforehand. If you've gone ahead and set up a core players group or research some leverage low-owned plays or something like that before the slate, all it takes is for one big significant piece of news to come out after lock, and that's going to reshift everything about the way that slate works, and a lot of your research gets invalidated. So that is another reason why I think if there was no late swap in NBA, I would have a pretty different looking process. But as it stands, that is what I do. Eric said, how often do you late swap? Do you late swap every sim update? Just wondering. Thanks. I would say the general best practice is yes, to late swap before the start of every next round of games, provided that simulations have run. And if you're unsure if sims have run, check the last updated timestamp up here, or check out the NBA lineup alerts channel in Slack, which will give you a little bit more detailed information about what games are having simulations run. That is best practice. In reality of what I actually end up doing is I will typically use the combination of the sim alerts channel to see when sims are running, along with Basketball Monster or some other news aggregator as a way of seeing what is happening. And there can be sometimes situations where I will skip a late swap if maybe a sim ran that, from my perspective, has probably a very minor or negligible effect. And it doesn't seem like any news broke. But I would say I'm pretty plugged into the NBA news cycle in general. I feel pretty comfortable making that decision. If you are unsure of if you should be late swapping, the best practice is always before the next start of the next round of games, anytime a sim has ran. So Ryan says, how does sim variance get incorporated when using custom projections? Good question. Anytime you make a custom projection change, so let's say we drop Jokic down to 53.28, we will take the difference of our mean projection and your mean projection, and we will adjust that player's output in every single simulation we have for that player by the same difference. So in this case, we subtracted 5 points from the mean for Nikola Jokic. So in the simulation where he scores 32 points, now he only scores 27 in that sim. In the simulation where he scores 95, now he only scores 90. What you get out of that is you still get to take advantage of the full range of outcomes of that player, and we are still pulling simulations in the same way, but they will be simulations for which the fantasy point output of players has been adjusted based on where you adjusted the custom projections. So, really good question there. Okay, cool. Eamon said, Jordan, I have a question. When you make adjustments in step 3, is it valid to say that the lineups you have made adjustments to are already in your pool and they rise from the bottom to the top based on your adjustments? I'm a little confused. So I will present step 3 in a little bit of a different way. Ultimately, I like to think about step 3 as providing you with a pool of viable lineups for the contest. So we will, if you go in here and just build a build, right? We will use SaberScore as a way of determining from top to bottom what the best overall lineup is to what the worst overall lineup is in the pool. But all 500 should ultimately be treated as viable for the contest because they were built with the settings that were optimized for that contest. So yes, if you restrict Derek White's maximum exposure to 50%, for example, you are theoretically pulling from lower SaberScore lineups to backfill in the additional 10 lineups that don't have Derek White, but you are pulling from a pool of lineups that was already viable, right? So yes, I mean, is it valid to say that the lineups you made adjustments to are already in your pool and they rise from the bottom to the top? Like, yeah, that is essentially what happens here. And I think SaberScore, thinking about step 3, I like to think about SaberScore and sorting by SaberScore and using the highest SaberScore lineups as a good tiebreaker. Once you have added all of the other value you want to add by making adjustments to exposures or even projections in step 3, then allow SaberScore to make the determination of what you actually should play in terms of those final lineups. But all of the lineups in your pool can be treated as viable, at least theoretically. So, cool. All right. Shoku's said, hey, man, I got the 7-day free trial last week. I've been winning a lot of contests these past couple days. You guys are top notch in my book. I will be purchasing this. Thank you. That's awesome. Happy to hear that. I do this stream every Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So as you continue to get familiar, especially with baseball coming up, other sports, maybe branching out into other sports, happy to answer any questions you have. But I'm glad you're having success. So, Guy Will Gamble said, what are your thoughts on the Minimax on DK? Should I still prioritize it over the 4-point play given the Minimax has less effective entrance? I've gone back and forth on this a lot myself recently. I am of the belief at this particular point, at least, and I think I may end up flip-flopping here a little bit. I'll say this first. I think those are close, ultimately. The advantage of the Minimax, in theory, compared, is that it is under $3. So you have a pool of players that don't even have access to play that contest, right? And you can typically get more. I mean, not even typically. You can just get more lineups into it, right? You can smooth out your variance a little bit more because you just have more lineups in play for approximately the same cost. The disadvantage to the Minimax is that it has a very low number of effective entrants. Typical Minimax for this point in the NBA season can be maxed out by theoretically just like 250 players. And it's cheap enough to max out that a lot of lower stakes grinders just will max it out. And it makes that contest play very sharp. You can actually compare ownership. I would, as a tester, check out the next time that there is a slate where there's a big late swap news that breaks. Compare the ownership of a player in even the 4-point play, maybe compare the ownership of the new elite value play that opened up from late swap and the 4-point play to the mini max, and you will visually see how much sharper the mini max can be than the 4-point play. But I still like that it's a little bit of a lower dollar price point and you can get more lineups and play into it. I am of the belief at the moment, right now, that I would prefer to play either the $3 or the $4.20 max in any sport than the mini max. I would play the mini max after the $3 or the $4.20 max once I had maxed that out. I do believe that the mini max is probably still better than a lot of the other contests that start to be available to you once you have that investment in a given slate, right? Once you're playing the $1.20 max, the quarter, the $3 or $4.20 max, and the mini max, and maybe the $3 max, and a lot of the single entries up to, I don't know, $10 to $15, you start to run a little dry on what contests are available to you if you are following strictly our contest selection principles. And I think the mini max is better than, some of the other options that are out there at that point. But when you're at this particular point, I would play if you only had $80 left and you've already played all the other great contests and you're deciding 4-point play or mini max, I'd play the 4-point play personally. So Clint said, Jordan, just tell them to press the money print button. Now for a real question. Yeah, it's kind of a joke, but it's also kind of not. Like the steps to being successful here are more about managing your bankroll to weather the swings and entering your lineups into the highest value contest as possible, and basically giving yourself the opportunity to realize the edge that you have, as opposed to a rigorous, detailed research process that takes hours to optimize for a single slate for which there would be a ton of variance anyway. Right? That's basically like the spirit of the push button print money thing. So Michael said, how often do you late swap? I think we kind of covered this with one of the last couple questions. But again, I think best practice here is if a new sim runs, so if this timestamp in the upper right has changed, or if you see a sim running in the NBA lineup alerts channel, you should run a late swap before the next start of games starts. So Guy Will Gamble said, yeah, I'm going back and forth on it currently as well. He said, does that answer change potentially if you're not maxing either? I would probably still prefer entries into the 4-point play first. I would max the 4-point play before I played any entries. I mean, I'm like basically in kind of a similar boat here. So what I'm doing right now is I have the 4-point play max and I have 60 entries in the mini max. Like $160 into the main slate is what I wanted in terms of action tonight. So that's how I did it. So I talked myself into playing the 4-point play ahead of the mini max actually somewhat recently after looking at the ownership differences on late swap value that opened up. I think at the end of the day, this contest, the mini max does play much sharper than this one. There is something to be said about the value of having 150 lineups in play instead of 20, but I don't think it outweighs the ownership inefficiencies here. So all right, I'm going to jump back to Slack here and hit a couple of these questions. There's one from James and Pat, and then we'll probably start to maybe wrap things up. So if you guys have any other questions here watching along, go ahead and get them in the queue now. And let's see what we've got here. So James said, hi, Jordan. How do you make two different contests from the size of the slate from 1,000 to 10,000 and 10,000 to 50,000? Because I played both contest sizes, but I don't know how to upload to DraftKings. I've been using one or the other, 1,000 to 10,000 or 10,000 to 50. When uploading all total 80 to 150 lineups I play for an NBA slate. This will be very much helpful. Thanks. Yeah, so the way I'm understanding this question, right, is you're playing a contest portfolio of a very diverse mix of different of contests, right? And what exactly should you, what slider should you use? And I do something very similar, right? So I'll wait for my entries to show up here, right? I've got 125 different contests, right? I would generally probably prefer to have a unique lineup into each contest that I'm playing here tonight. But we have single entries, we have 150 max, we have a 20 max, we have a variety of different contest sizes. So what should you do? What I would recommend is picking a midpoint set of sliders here that kind of are approximately in the middle of all of the different contests you're playing, right? So what you, like, for example, we can take the single entry, the smallest single entries I'm playing, I think are right about here, which are 513. The biggest one is a 150 max that is right about here. So 513 to 438, right? Typically a very good midpoint set of sliders, which is why if you're playing a very typical spread of contests, is the 20 max 10 to 50K. I think you'll find that in general, something close to this will be a pretty good midpoint set of sliders. You are theoretically going to sacrifice. Oh, well, let me finish this first. And then what I would do is I would say, here's the exact number of lineups I need. I need 125. And I would probably also increase my pool size up to 1,500 since I'm playing so many lineups. And that would be the sliders I would use. That would be the build settings that I would use. I would build on something like this to get that done. And you are theoretically, yes, going to sacrifice maybe a little bit of edge because your sliders are not perfectly optimized for every individual contest setting. You are, however, going to gain a lot more value back from, one, putting a unique lineup into every single contest, but two, having one single build from which you are managing your exposures and kind of finalizing your portfolio. It is a lot of work, frankly, to manage 5 different builds because you built a separate build for each individual lineup combination or contest combination that there is. Ultimately, the sliders, while they are optimized for particular contest types, and I would never recommend somebody arbitrarily move the sliders around just because, there's not an enormous impact in terms of the expected value of your lineups on a singular slate of using the 20 max sliders on a single entry, right? It is likely that a good lineup for those contests are still good. So, okay. And then Pat asks the question here and said, I wasn't part of a SaberSim at the beginning of the NBA or NHL season, so I'm curious how accurate the simulations are at the beginning of the season. So for MLB just starting, is it best to wait a couple weeks for the simulations to really start hitting their stride after a couple of games have been played? This goes both ways, ultimately. Yes, there is a little bit of variance to projections at the start of the season, especially as players are playing on new teams, new situations. I think there can be a little bit of an argument to be made that simulations will dial in further as the season goes on a little bit. However, 2 things, really, I guess. One, that is true for everyone. So it is hard for everyone to project a little more at the start of the season because you are kind of assembling new information. On opening day, your most recent baseball game that you can rely on is theoretically the last slate of the regular season, at least where you had all of the teams in play, right? So that's a problem for everybody. So it doesn't really necessarily give you less of an edge at that point. It increases the variance. It makes, I would say, strategically speaking, it should make you probably feel a little more skeptical of the chalk overall because everybody's going to have a hard time knowing what the best plays are closer to the start of the season, especially in a high variance sport like baseball. I don't know if I would say don't play. I would say maybe spread out your exposures a little more and maybe be a little more skeptical of chalk because it's going to be hard for everybody to determine. Even Vegas, it's harder for Vegas to determine what the best plays are at the start of the season. The other factor to this is that there's a lot of excitement at the start of the season. You'll typically get your biggest contests and you'll get your softest competition at the start of baseball season, right? So I wouldn't want to just skip out the first 2 weeks of the season where your theoretical ROI might be its highest because the competition is the softest, right? There's a lot of casual fans that will, maybe dabble a little bit in baseball DFS by the start of the season and go broke or get bored as the season goes on by like August, September. That by that time in the year, you're playing against competition where everybody's projections have gotten better. Everybody's data has gotten better and a lot of the soft competition has fallen off. So I would not skip out I think this is a sharp point. I think it is definitely fair to say that it is harder to project at the start of the season, but that is a problem for everybody. And I would not skip out on slates where you can get opportunities to play very soft competition. I would instead think about the implications of what that is and spread out your exposures maybe a little bit more, and be skeptical of chalk early in the season, because it's probably, I mean, I think all chalk in baseball is bad chalk is a very broad generalization. That's probably bad, but not that bad. At the start of the season, I think that's even more valuable to say, right? You really, pitchers are one thing, but with your stacks and hitters, it's a tough sell to say you want to be over the field on like whatever the chalkiest stack is on any given slate, and especially at the start of the season. So anyway, good question. All right. I don't see any other questions here coming in here, so we will go ahead and cap it off there. So it's good to be back. Thank you to everybody that tuned into the stream here and gave me a warm welcome. Apologies for our brief little internet blip here. We had about a half an hour ago, but that's fitting for my first stream back from a couple days off. So we will be right back here again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions for me as you are building your lineups for tonight, feel free to email us, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. We'll get to them tomorrow. Again, stay tuned over the next 10 days, 2 weeks. For baseball content, we'll be doing some baseball streams, some baseball videos coming out. The team's working really hard to get everything on our end up and ready for the baseball season. So good luck. Enjoy this weird slate here tonight. We've got it really is a strange one here. It is like a tank fest in this last island game of the night, and all of the values coming from this weird game. Well, it'll be a strange one, but good luck. Enjoy it, especially as we're winding down the NBA regular season. And I will be right back here again tomorrow. So until then, see ya.